Hi there, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is you're watching this. Welcome to Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson, your host, and for about half an hour I'm going to be rattling on about things that I think are worthy of your attention, so pay attention. If you have any comments, questions, reactions, as always, you can email them to me directly. My personal email, whoviating, WHOVIATING @AOL.com. And if you didn't catch that, go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. You can get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. If you do email me, as always, please include something in the subject line to make it clear this is not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer. You will get one, but I'm not very good about answering emails, so be a little patient. Anyway, starting, as I always like to when I can, with some good news. The FCC has voted to make net neutrality a legal as well as a philosophical reality. On Thursday, February 26th, the agency voted to regulate broadband as a public utility under Title II of the Telecommunications Act. So, no fast lanes or slow lanes on the internet. No favoritism for websites that forked over extra bucks to the telecoms. No throttling, that is deliberate slowing of the transmission of information. All information, all data is to be treated equally. In other words, net neutrality. The same open, I guess you could call it small d democratic internet, that small d democratic nature under which the internet has grown and flourished to the point where it has become a routine part of many of our lives, that's going to continue. And of course, the big telecoms like Verizon and Comcast and AT&T, they'd been drooling over the idea of being able to squeeze a few extra bucks out of websites to offer them premium speeds over competing websites. So of course, they hate this idea, and they still do. In fact, in a truly lame attempt at mockery of this, Verizon issued its response to the FCC ruling in Morse code, and then offered a translation that looked like it had been done on a 1980s IBM manual typewriter with a worn piece of carbon paper. The statement itself from Verizon was just basically another rehash of corporate PR BS, with the same moldy claims that the regulations will stifle innovation, harm consumers, and basically bring an end to the entire technological world to which we've become accustomed, without actually being able to cite a single reason why that would happen. Which is perhaps not surprising when you consider that Sprint and Cablevision have already publicly acknowledged that these regulations will have no impact on their investment in their networks. And when they're pressed, other top executives of major telecoms will admit that no, they're not going to stop investing in their networks, even as their PR departments and their lobbyists screech that these regulations are going to bring such investment to a screeching halt. And by the way, and as a quick aside, those claims about some impact on investment they actually become downright offensive when you consider that we as Americans don't have a lot to celebrate in that department. Each of the last 3 years, the Open Technology Institute has issued a report called The Cost of Connectivity. And in each of those years, it has found that, quoting, the majority of U.S. cities surveyed lag behind their international peers, paying more money for slower service. But for the moment, just be glad that if you want to read an online magazine or listen to some music or download that vacation picture Aunt Gracie sent you, your speed will not drop to dial-up levels simply because some other magazine or music site or email account ponied up some extra bucks that your choices either wouldn't or couldn't. Be aware, though, this fight is not over. Outfits like Verizon and the rest have really, really deep pockets, and they are already cranking up the deception machine with its loudspeakers pointed directly at the public as they try to influence Congress to overturn the regulations. For one example, Michael Powell just wrote a piece for the online tech magazine CNET. Now, who is Michael Powell? He is the former chair of the FCC, who was known to be almost embarrassingly pro-business when he was in that position, and when he left the agency, became president and CEO of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association. In this bit of baloney, Powell repeated all of the claims of the dire consequences of not letting the telecoms do pretty much whatever they want, again without actually offering any reason as to why any of that would happen. But here's the thing I wanted to bring up about this. In this ad accountant approved advertorial, Powell starts by saying very loudly, "I support net neutrality," and then says there's little disagreement over the substance of internet principles. He then adds this, quote, I'm quoting exactly, "The cable industry has lived by the 4 freedoms that I laid out as FCC chairman roughly a decade ago. Freedom to access content, to run applications, to attach devices, and to obtain service plan information." Now, leaving aside the utter absurdity of some of that list, like, oh wow, you have the freedom to know what your cable company is going to charge you, listen again to his list of open internet principles. Freedom to access content, freedom to run applications, freedom to attach devices, freedom to obtain service plan information. Now, do you notice anything missing from that list? How about the freedom to access sites on an equal basis? How about the freedom to have your data treated the same as all other data? How about the freedom that is the central argument over net neutrality? That freedom does not exist in his list. When the telecoms and their paid-off stooges in Congress tell you they support net neutrality, they are lying to you, and don't you ever forget it. All right, we're going to slip right in from that outrage to another outrage, the outrage of the week. And it's one of our regular features, and this week I have to say it leaves me seething with fury over the inhumanly cold response to a tragedy we are seeing in the city of Cleveland, Ohio. It has to do with the killing of 12-year-old Tamir Rice by Cleveland cops on November 22nd, 2014. It was another in a string of incidents around the country where cops had killed unarmed African Americans. To understand my outrage, you have to understand some of the background of this case. So forgive me if I'm going to go over information that you may already know. First thing is that in the wake of the killing, the Cleveland police put out their version of events, one which was riddled with demonstrable lies because, unfortunately for them, they didn't know there was a surveillance video. For example, the cops claimed that Tamir Rice was seated at a table with other people. The video clearly shows he was alone the whole time. They said that they pulled up, they saw him grab the gun and put it in his waistband. The video shows him standing by where the car stopped. There was no place to grab a gun from. They said they got out of the car and told him 3 times to put up his hands, but he refused. Now, the video of the killing with a stopwatch added to it shows that Tamir was shot and killed literally 0.8 seconds after the cop got out of the car. Claiming the cops had time to tell him anything 3 times is sheer lunacy. They also said that after he refused to put his hands up, he then reached into his waistband and pulled out the gun, forcing cop Timothy Lohman to kill him. The video proves he did not pull out any gun. And the gun, by the way, was a toy air gun. It's an air pistol. The police made much of the fact that on this air pistol that the orange tip supposed to identify it as a toy had been removed. But since the cops never saw the tip of the gun until after Tamir Rice lay on the ground dying because he never pulled that gun out, the thing about the orange tip is an utter irrelevancy that's intended to distract from the hard facts. The cops drove up, hopped out, and shot Tamir Rice down without hesitation or giving him any chance at all to comply with any demands. They then failed to offer him any first aid. But instead, they did tackle and handcuff his sister when she came screaming up trying to get to her little brother who was lying on the ground bleeding to death. Another, by the way, apparently failing to find anything about Tamir Rice the cops could use for the typical after-the-fact trashing of the victim's reputation, Cleveland authorities resorted to trying to trash the reputations of his parents, who had apparently had some run-ins with the law. Okay, that's the background, one marked with lies, misdirection, shifting stories, and character assassination. All of which is not surprising, frankly, in coming from a police department that was recently found by the Department of Justice to be reckless, quote unquote, and to use guns, tasers, pepper spray, and their fists excessively, unnecessarily, or in retaliation at a significant rate, to the point where a federal court is now going to be keeping tabs on the Cleveland police. Which finally brings us to the current outrage. Now, as part of this, we're going to skip mostly the latest brain-dead racist frothings of Steve Loomis, who is the president of the Cleveland Police Patrolmen's Association. He recently described Tamir Rice as a boy in an adult body and called him menacing, 5'7", 191 pounds, and one of those people. Apparently because anyone 5'7" is menacing, even though that's actually shorter than the average height for an adult male, or to put it more exactly, anyone 5'7" is menacing if they're African American. But let's leave Loomis aside so we can go wash his white hood before the next meeting. What I wanted more to address is that on December 5th, Tamir Rice's family filed a wrongful death suit against Lohman, his partner Frank Garmbach, and the city of Cleveland. The city of Cleveland has now filed its response to that suit. Now, as I'm sure you expect, it denies as many points as it can and declares others it doesn't really know enough to make a statement one way or the other. But in the course of its response, a certain bit of wording came up repeatedly. I'm going to quote this wording. In light of the fact that the circumstances of this incident will not be known until the completion of the investigation by the Cuyahoga County Sheriff's Office, this defendant, that is the city of Cleveland, is without knowledge or information sufficient to form a belief. Regarding a certain assertion in the family suit. That wording in their brief was used 111 times, and yes, I counted. 111 times in the course of this brief, the city of Cleveland said, in effect, there's an investigation going on. We don't know yet what happened. We got to wait till the investigation is done. Now, after doing that 111 times, in its own affirmative defenses, the city says, and I'm quoting, plaintiffs' decedents' injuries, losses, and damages complained of were directly and proximately caused by the failure of the plaintiff's decedent to exercise due care to avoid injury, and plaintiff's decedents' injuries, losses, and damages complained of were directly and proximately caused by the acts of the plaintiff's decedent, not this defendant. Now, translated from the legalese, the city of Cleveland is saying that it was Tamir Rice's own fault that he was shot down by a trigger-happy cop and who left him on the ground bleeding to death. It was his own fault that he's dead. Nothing to do with us. No, sirree. Now look, I know all about using boilerplate legalistic languages, and I know all about how you want to assert every defense you can at the beginning of a case because you may not be able to bring them up later on. But to assert 111 times that what happened isn't known because the investigation isn't complete, and then immediately after that to say, but we do know it was his own fault, that proves the city here has one and only one concern here, and it's not justice or fairness or even simple human decency or even the desire or the intention or even the hope to try to see something like this doesn't happen again. Their one solitary concern is getting off the hook, having no responsibility, of being able to look at the mother of a dead 12-year-old that one of your employees killed and go, hey, whatever. I don't know how to express the depths of the outrage involved here. But according to Tamir's mother, the city has never even told her through any official that it's sorry that this happened. How can you do that? How can an administration be that cold? It's an outrage. And I have to add a quick footnote very quickly here. Cleveland Mayor Frank Jackson offered an apology for the insensitive language used in the city's brief, and said the city would file an amended brief in a few days. However, city representative, spokesman for the city, Dan Ball, said the city will change the language in the answer, but, quoting, they intend to preserve all of their defenses, unquote. In other words, they are still going to blame Tamir Rice for his own killing at the hands of a trigger-happy cop. They're just going to find nicer-sounding words to do it. I really don't understand why that's supposed to make a difference. We're taking a break. Okay, and we're back. Bibi Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, gave his speech to Congress, in which he, as expected, decried any deal with Iran and predicted the looming apocalypse of an Iranian nuclear weapon, much to the delight of various right-wing twits, which includes a fair number of Democrats who have been dreaming of seeing blood on the sands of Iran for some time now. Columnist David Ignatius of the Washington Post called it a well-crafted speech. And it damn well better be by this time, because he's been giving essentially the same speech for over 20 years, predicting Iran is a couple of years away, or a year away, or on the verge of developing a nuclear weapon. Also in the Post, much to my surprise, Dana Milbank, who I sometime back dubbed our Lord of Perpetual Smirk, actually made an insightful observation. Netanyahu's purpose, in fact, was to get Congress, in essence, to declare war on Iran for him. He wants such conditions to be put on negotiations that everyone would know Iran would never accept, leaving, of course, the breakdown of negotiations and military force as apparently the only available option. Military action, of course, that the U.S. would have to undertake. Put another way, Bibi Netanyahu doesn't want an agreement. He doesn't want a settlement. He doesn't want peace. He wants, again, to get the U.S. Congress to declare war on Iran for him. And too many in Congress seem ready to join him in his paranoia to do it, to join in the cause of war on Iran, even though, and this cannot be said often enough, there is no hard evidence that Iran is actually trying to, or would want to try to, build a nuclear weapon. And maybe that's why Netanyahu doesn't want an agreement. Because if there is one, it might prove that the Iranian bomb, whether or not it was real at some point in the past, is now just a fantasy that he is simply pursuing for his own political gain. All right, moving on from there, we've got another RIP this week. I came into work the other day, and the very first thing my boss said to me was, "Did you hear the terrible, horrible news?" There always seeming to be a plethora of such things. I said, "Which terrible, horrible news?" And that's how I found out that Leonard Nimoy had died. He was 83, and he died of end-stage COPD. Leonard Nimoy, of course, was best known as Mr. Spock in the Star Trek universe, starting with what later became known as STTOS, Star Trek, the original series, continuing through movies right into Next Generation. Lots of people, famous and not, remembered him in tweets. My favorite of the ones that I saw actually came from actress Mindy Kaling, which consisted of 3 quotes. "This is the Mughal Omni Theater," "Because he grew up 6 blocks from here," and "Who put the bomb?" I loved it because I immediately knew exactly what she meant. In the years after the original series ended, he chafed at being so totally identified with a single role, as I expect most any actor would, so much so that he wrote an autobiography in 1975 titled "I Am Not Spock." 20 years later, having come to terms with and even embraced the connection, he wrote a second volume called "I Am Spock." So, yeah, he was Spock, but he was also more. He had an acting career quite apart from Star Trek, both before and after the series, plus being a director, an author, a poet, a photographer, and an art collector. But at the end of it all, he was Spock. So it's fitting that he came to sign off his tweets with LLAP, which, just in case you have just recently arrived here from an alternate time-space dimension, stood for "Live long and prosper." R.I.P. Leonard Nimoy. All right, from there, moving on to our other regular weekly feature, it's the Clown Award, given as always for meritorious stupidity. This week, the big red nose goes to a man whose actual middle name, Mountain, is quite appropriate because he clearly has rocks in his head. A man who is definitely from the wrong state because he surely is not okay. Oklahoma Senator James Inhofe. Last week he came to the Senate floor and proceeded to take a snowball out of a plastic bag and declare that because he was able to gather that snowball outside the Capitol because it was unseasonably cold in Washington, D.C., that somehow meant that global warming was a hoax. He went on to cite National Weather Service records showing 67 new record lows in the 2 days preceding that, all across the eastern United States, which, in fact, overnight lows had been as much as 30 to 40 degrees below normal everywhere from Indiana to New England. Inhofe declared that this meant the script had flipped on global warming. Now, the thing is, what kind of abominable ignorance, what kind of willful numbskullery does it take for Inhofe, who chairs the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, what kind of inanity does it take for a man in that position to still not get the difference between weather and climate? Weather is short-term and local. Climate is neither. But even just considering weather, Inhofe is still a twit. At the same time that a bunch of places in the eastern U.S. were setting record lows, an even greater number of places in the western United States were setting record highs. The National Climatic Data Center reported that for the period of December 2014 to January 15, the average temperature for the U.S. as a whole was nearly 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 2 degrees Celsius above normal. But I'm going to emphasize again, that's just 2 months' data. That's weather. My point here is that even arguing by his own terms, Inhofe is still a twit. Honor for the best slapdown of Senator Rocks in his head, though, goes to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who said at considerably greater length and with far more detail than I'm going to provide here, but in some he said, we can believe NASA, we can believe the United States Navy, which regards global warming as its greatest security challenge. We can believe a long string of major corporations, which are concerned that global warming presents economic risks. We can believe every single major U.S. scientific society, or he riffed in each case in just these words, or we can believe the senator with the snowball. At a time when evidence of not just of climate change, but of actual existing, ongoing, damaging effects of climate change, including one report that suggests that the California drought may be due to climate change, and another that says the 4-year-long drought in Syria that helped to spark the civil war that has killed thousands so far was the result of climate change. Fables and fantasies like Inhofe's literally are costing people's lives. James Inhofe is a waste of space, a jackass, an embarrassment to the nation, and possibly the world's biggest clown. All right, finally for this week. Last week, I said that I oppose the new authorization to use military force that Barack Obama wants, and I urge revocation of the existing authority to use military force that Obama has used as authority for his lovely little war. I also said there are better ways to struggle against the fanaticism of Daesh, that is ISIS, and that I would lay out some, which is what I'm going to do. Because it seems to me that the key to fighting Daesh is not to try to destroy it, but to isolate it and then just let it shrivel for lack of life support. We have to start by realizing what Daesh how it views itself. Because Daesh regards itself as the true revival of the early Islamic Caliphate, destined not only to maintain but to expand their theocratic state. That extreme view is not only its greatest strength, it's also its greatest weakness. Because for one thing, it makes it impossible for Daesh to ever form reliable allies, because all of them would have to offer their total and absolute adherence to its extremist and narrow theocracy. And in their view, nobody, not even Al-Qaeda, is sufficiently pure. It also means that once they declared their caliphate, once they used Islamic State and said that all Muslims should offer their fealty to that state, the legitimacy came to depend on their ability to maintain that state. But states, unlike insurgencies, not only have borders to defend, more importantly, they have, for lack of a better term, a business model to maintain. And there are already signs that the supposed caliphate's business model is already starting to fail. For example, they're facing a potential food shortage because a lot of local farmers have not planted their normal amount of seed because they couldn't access their land, or they didn't have proper the fertilizer or fuel, or because they didn't expect the caliphate to buy their crops the way Baghdad had been. Meanwhile, to sustain itself to this point, Daesh has pretty much relied on theft, but now it seized pretty much everything there is to seize, while making enemies of states in the region that might have offered them support from the outside. Building a sustainable economy, this is the most important part, building a sustainable economy in this caliphate would require gaining support from within, hearts and minds and all that. And at the same time, that would require relaxing your authoritarian rule while trying to gain local allies by limiting expansionism, softening your rhetoric, and even changing your core mission, none of which Daesh can do without no longer being what it is. Finally, I have to say that I've been saying this from the beginning. I've been saying this since last June. We need to realize that most of Daesh's support in Iraq comes from disaffected Sunnis who have been first abandoned and then oppressed by the increasingly dictatorial rule of the Shiite-dominated government in Baghdad. So it's all that in mind, what's the better way? All right, I note at the top, by the way, these proposals are not original to me. All right, they're not original to me, but these are proposals. First, realizing that bombing Daesh only makes them look like victims in the eyes of many, particularly the Sunnis in western Iraq. Stop doing it. 2, go after the money supply. Hit Daesh economically. It's been largely self-funded so far, but that's ending. 3, crack down on the weapons supply, not only by cooperation with regional governments, but by ending U.S. military aid to the area. 4, address the political grievances of local populations, particularly the Sunnis in western Iraq. Tell Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi that future support from the U.S. will depend upon a rapprochement with the Sunnis, and mean it. Finally, provide humanitarian assistance to all who need it, regardless of political affiliation. That's how you deal with fanaticism. Not by destroying it, but by dissolving it. Not by killing the fanatics, but by, if you will, killing the reasons other people would have to join them. As the great A.J. Muste once said, there is no way to peace. Peace is the way. Exactly the same thing can be said of justice. That's it for this week. We're out of here. We will see you next week. Have the best week you can. For now, peace.